Hello fellow SolidWorks API users. My name is Keith with CADsharp.com, and in this video I want to continue a series that I began last year by showing you how to create simple yet powerful macros once you have a basic understanding of the SolidWorks API. That means that if you have no experience whatsoever with programming, some of this might seem a little bit over your head. So what I'd recommend you do first is go to www.cadsharp.com, check out some of our free SolidWorks API programming tutorials, and then come back here and this video might make more sense. So to get started, let's talk about the macro we're going to program from scratch here in a moment. This is the elbow that's used in a paintball gun, and right now we have one configuration. And basically what I'm going to do is create a second configuration that contains a mirrored version, or you could say a left-hand version of this part. And that's a common way to work with right-hand and left-hand versions of parts. So when you bring the component into an assembly, you can choose which version you need. So how would you go about creating that left-hand version manually? Well, to start off, I'm going to create a new configuration, and I'll just keep it simple and call this opposite. And I'll click OK, and I'll just click yes to that. And I want to point something out regarding the default configuration. If I go here into Properties, notice that it has Suppress Features checked. That's important. So whenever I'm in this new configuration, whenever I add a new feature, it's going to be suppressed in the first one. So I'm going to stay in this opposite configuration, and I'm going to go up to mirror then, and I'm actually going to create the mirror. And for the mirror plane, I'll select the front plane, and for bodies to mirror, I'm going to select that single body in the display area, and I'm going to turn off Merge Solids. So I'll click OK. And next I need to go to my solid bodies list, and I'm going to click on the first body, hit the delete key, and it's going to let me insert a delete body feature. So let's zoom to fit there, and now if I toggle back and forth between the two configurations, there's my right hand and my left hand version, so to speak. So basically we're going to create a macro that runs through all those steps for us. It's going to add the configuration and then add those two features, and then we want to save the part, and then afterward I'm going to show you how you can upgrade the macro so it will actually perform these operations on every single part in a specified folder in case you had to perform these operations in bulk. So before we get started writing that, let me reload this macro. And we'll go back here, and one other thing I want to point out is that if you look up next to the part icon, notice how it has that little graduation cap. That means that this part was originally created in an educational version. And that's going to be very important later on, because we're going to have to take into consideration the fact that when you open up an educational version part, this dialog box normally comes up. So we need a way to deal with that, because obviously you don't want to start a macro running overnight only to come into the office the next morning to realize that it had been sitting at this dialog box the entire time. So to create our brand new macro, we're going to go to our macro toolbar and click New Macro, and make sure it's on SWP, and we'll just call this something like Create Left-Hand Version. You can call it whatever you want, and whenever you hit Enter, the Microsoft Visual Basic Editor is going to pop up. So starting off, we have our 4 default lines of code that come with every new macro. But before I start actually working in the code, I want to paste in the assumptions that this macro is going to be making, and that's a very good thing to do when you write a macro, because the number of assumptions you include can really greatly affect how much code you actually have to write. So what are some of the assumptions we're going to be making? We're going to assume that the part can be mirrored about the front plane, so that means that the part has to be designed a certain way. We're also assuming that there's only one solid body in the part, so not a multi-body, and then that aforementioned plane, the XY plane, in fact, is called front plane, as opposed to just front or 1 or something like that. And then finally, there's one configuration called default, and it has the property suppress new features enabled. And now, before we start programming, I want to do one other thing with the comments, and that's just kind of outline what this macro is actually going to do. And with all that commenting in place, things are outlined a little better, just like you would want to outline an essay before you write it. So for starters, I'm going to move this variable down in the main subprocedure, and the reason I'm doing that isn't because I have to do it, it's just because I want to keep my variable declaration and my variable assignment close to one another. And if you're at all familiar with API programming, you know that these two lines are the lines used to connect us to the SolidWorks application and get the pointer to the application, so to speak. And as is good programming practice, what we're going to do is change that from object, which is the more generic variable data type, to sldworks.sldworks, and that's the more specific variable type. So in fact, if we want, what we could even do is just say connect to the application up there. Be really thorough. Now, to get the active document, first I'm going to declare a model.doc2 variable. And of course, model.doc2 can represent any type of SolidWorks document, part, assembly, or drawing. It contains functionality that's generic to all of them. And the way we access the model is like this: set swModel equals swApp ActiveDoc. So we're using a property within the ISLDworks interface called ActiveDoc, and that's going to return to us the active document, of course. Now next up, we're going to add the other configuration. So what we're going to do is use a method within iModelDoc2 called addConfiguration3, and so that's going to look like this: addConfiguration3, and that comes with a few arguments. First of all, the name, and that's actually the only one we're really interested in using, so we'll just say opposite. And then comment, alternate name, and options, those refer to, of course, the different properties you can fill in the configuration manager. And for our purposes here, we actually don't care about any of them, so we can actually just put in empty, and we're basically ignoring them. So now at this point, I think it would be good to actually run the macro. So we'll come up here and click the Run button. And if we go back to the part, we can go into the configuration manager and see that indeed a configuration called opposite has been added. Alright, so next up on the list is select the front plane and mark it. So to select the front plane, what we're going to do is use an API call called selectById2. And notice to get to it, I typed in the iModelDoc2 variable name and then dot and then extension and then select by ID2. Sometimes you'll see API calls that belong under iModelDoc extension, and you can access them just like this. And there's several arguments here. So the first argument we need is the name of the object we're trying to select. And in this case, we're making the assumption that the plane is called front plane. And then for type, we're going to type in whatever the object type is. And I know from the API help that what I need to type in is plane, just like that. So if you're new to using this API call, check out the API help, see what you need to type. I'll also note that this method is not good if you're trying to select a face or an edge or something that really doesn't have a name. If you need to select one of those things, then you want to use IEntitySelectFor. However, this method is really great and really simple to use if whatever you need to select is found within the feature manager tree. And so that's why we're using it right now. And in our case, the front plane, since we already have the name and the type, we don't need to specify a location. So I'm actually just going to put in 0 and 0, 0 for those. And then for append, this is asking us, do we want to append this selection of the front plane onto the existing selection list, or do we want to wipe out that list and make this the new sole selection? And in our case, that is what we want to do, because we don't want random stuff to be selected when we go to mirror the body. The only things we want selected are the front plane and the body. So I'm going to type in false. And now mark. This is very important. Basically, if you were to look in the API help at the API call that's used to insert a mirror feature, you would see that the API call needs some way to distinguish between the plane that the object is being mirrored about and then also the object itself. So the way the SolidWorks API distinguishes between the objects is through marks. The plane that is being used needs to be marked with an integer value of 2. And then later the body, we're going to mark that with a value of 256, but we'll do that in a moment. Continuing with the select by ID 2 method, for callout, we don't need that, so we're going to put in nothing, and then we're not going to do any special options for selection, so I'm just going to put in 0. So now let's run this, and if we come back here, we see that the front plane is selected, so things are going good thus far. So we'll go ahead and reload that, go back to our code, and now we're going to select the body and mark it, and this is going to be a little bit more complicated. And you might think, well, wait a second, why don't we just get the body name and put that name in for this argument, and then we can figure out whatever string we need to put in for the type, and then just select it like that. Well, we could do that, except one of the assumptions we did not include up here is the name of the body. We actually want to make this macro a little bit more versatile, so to speak, a little bit more flexible. And so in our case, the name of the solid body is body move copy 1. Maybe it'll be another body name in some other part. So how are we going to deal with this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to get all of the bodies in the part. And since we're assuming that there's only one body in the part, we're just going to grab the first element of that array that gets returned to us. We're going to set that item equal to an iBody2 object, and then we're going to use iBody2 select2, and that's going to be the method that we're going to use to select the body. So in the SolidWorks API, a lot of objects like bodies, edges, vertices, faces, they have their own methods built in for selecting them. That's basically what we're doing here. So for variables, I'm going to say dim swpart as SLDworks partDoc, and the reason we're creating a iPartDoc variable is because that is the object that allows us to get the bodies in the part. Then we're going to declare a iBody2 object. Then also we're going to create an array, and arrays in the SolidWorks API when you're using Visual Basic for applications are defined as variant, because a variant can hold any data type. And then I'm also going to create two variables for the selection manager, and then another one for select data, and you'll see why I'm doing that in a moment. But first, let's actually get the body. So we'll use each of these variables in the order that we declared them. Set to swpart equals swmodel, and the reason I can do that is because if you remember, iModelDoc2 can be used to represent iPartDoc, iAssemblyDoc, or iDrawingDoc, and so we can actually do what's called a cast, and we can cast this higher level variable down to this lower level variable. And then once we have our iPartDoc variable, what we're going to do is say vBodies equals swpart dot get bodies. And there's going to be a couple of arguments we're going to use here. First of all, for body type, we're going to say all bodies, and then for the other argument, visible only, we're going to say false. So that's basically going to let us get bodies in a part even if they're invisible. Now moving on, we have returned this array of all the bodies in the part, and remember, one of our assumptions is that there is only one body in the part. So what we can do is say set swbody equals vBodies, and then in parentheses, since it's an array, we can put the index. Arrays start with an index value of 0, so since I can assume single body, I can just put in a 0 that's going to grab the first body and the only body, and it's going to set it equal to my swbody variable here. And now I can use swbody select2 like I mentioned, and this will actually select the body. So append as Boolean. For this I want to say true because I don't want to wipe out the selection list. I want the front plane to remain selected. because it needs to be selected alongside the body when I use insert mirror feature 2. Now for data as select data, what is this? This is actually asking for an object to be passed in as one of the arguments. Well, this is also the object that we use to mark the body, and we do have to mark the body with that value of 256 like I mentioned. So I'm going to put in SW cell data like that, but the first thing we need to do is actually use that SW cell data properly so it contains the mark value. So this is where these guys are going to come in. Basically, we're going to say SW cell MGR equals SW model dot selection manager. That's going to get the object called the selection manager that's used for all things related to selection. So not just creating this guy, but also if you were trying to get a pre-selected object in SolidWorks, you would use an API call called iSelectionMGR getSelectedObject6, and that would get whatever object is pre-selected in the display area. But in this case, we're just going to use it to create the select data object. So that's done using create select data. There's no arguments there. And once we've done that, we can call this property within cell data called mark, and we're going to set that equal to 256. And now this object is being passed in here, and so it's going to know when we select the body, also mark that with a value of 256. So you can see that this was a lot more of a complicated way to select something versus using select by ID2. And the reason is we're not assuming the body name. If we were assuming a certain body name, then we could have replaced all this with just one line. So it goes back to what I said earlier. Assumptions make a huge difference in your code. They can make your code very short but very inflexible, or very long but very flexible. And that's a consideration you have to make as a good API programmer. So now that we have selected both the bodies with the API, which I'll demonstrate right now, there you go, both are selected and marked. Now we can actually mirror the body. So this is where we're going to use that insert mirror feature 2 API call, and that's part of the feature manager, which you access through iModelDoc2. So what we can do is we can actually say SWModel feature manager, and I'll hit tab, hit dot again, and kind of like what we did up here with extension, we don't even have to declare that in-between middleman, so to speak. And then we'll put in insert mirror feature 2, and this is going to contain a few arguments. First of all, do we want to mirror a body or do we want to mirror faces or features? Yes, we do want to mirror body, so we're going to put in true. Next up, do we want to do a geometry pattern? No, we won't, so we'll just do false. Next, do we want to merge the bodies? No, we definitely do not, so that's going to be false. Do we want to knit the bodies? Well, that only applies if we're dealing with surface bodies, so it's actually irrelevant what we put in there. I'll just put in false. And then finally, the scope, I know for a fact, because I looked in the API help, that this option applies to multi-body parts. We're not in a multi-body part, so I can just put in 0. So now let's try this out. And there we go. The mirror has been successfully created. Now next up, we're going to delete the original body, and the way we're going to do that is again using the feature manager. So obviously you can tell that most of the features you create are created through the feature manager. And in the case of the delete body feature, that's done using insert delete body just like that, and it has no arguments. But it does have one prerequisite, and that is that the body you want to delete is actually selected. So what we're going to do before we delete the body is we're going to reselect this body up here, and we already have access to it in this variable. So I'm just going to type in swbody select2, and we'll say false because we want to wipe out the current selection list. Now, in order to use insert delete body, do we need to have it marked? Well, you could look in the API help, and the answer is no, you don't. So we can actually ignore this select data guy. We can just put in nothing. Alright, so as always, let's run this and come back here, and it looks like it's working. So not bad. Now, where do we go from here? Well, the next thing I want to do is implement some code so that we actually save the part, and then I'm going to show you how you can beef up the code by allowing this operation to be performed on all of the parts in a specified directory. So we'll start off with the save code, and the way we're going to do that is by using the save3 method. And there's a few options we're going to put in here, actually only one. And in our case, we're going to do this one called save as option silent, and that's basically going to suppress any messages related to things like, do you want to rebuild the part before you save, stuff like that. And those are annoying because if they pop up while the macro is running, then the macro is going to pause and it's going to wait for user input. Likewise, in a moment, we're going to have to deal with that dialog box telling us that this part was created in an educational version. So for errors and warnings, these are actually output arguments. Again, I knew that via the API help. And with output arguments, what's happening is we are getting information back. It's like a return value, essentially. And so with errors and warnings, we can find out what went wrong if something goes wrong with the save. But in our case, I know nothing's going to go wrong, so I'm just going to put in empty. So let's save this, and I'm not going to run it. I'm actually going to comment this out because while I'm testing the code, I don't want to accidentally be saving my test parts. Alright, so how do we convert this macro so it can be run on any part in a directory? Well, to start off with, I'm going to create a constant, and this is going to contain the string that refers to the directory I want. And I'm going to put that final backslash on, and you'll see why in a moment. Now, down here under get active document, we're actually going to remove this because we no longer want to get the active document. Instead, we want to open an existing document. So I'll just get rid of this and this, and I'll go ahead and leave that up here. And what I'm going to say is dim str file name as string, and then str file name is going to be equal to the first SLD PRT in this directory. So how do I get that? Well, I get that using a VBA function, meaning that it's a function that's actually built into the Visual Basic for Applications programming language called dir. And what I do here is I type in the directory path, and then I concatenate that with the extension I want. So I'm going to use a wildcard here, and it's going to look like that because I want SLD PRT. And then for this file attribute, I'm just going to do normal. And so what's going to happen is this function is basically going to take a look in this directory. It's going to look for the first SLD PRT, and it's going to return the name of that file as this string, str file name. So that's going to get us the first SLD PRT, and then what we're going to do is say while str file name is not empty, and we're going to use those two brackets facing one another to indicate is not. And then I'm going to take all of this and I'm going to indent it a little bit because that's good programming practice. And I'm going to close off that while loop with a WEND, wind. That basically indicates I'm ending the while loop down there. So basically, while str file name is not empty, it's going to keep looping through this code. So right now, the way it is, it's going to be in an infinite loop because it's going to grab that first file name and it's just going to keep running this code over and over again. What I need to do down here is say str file name equals dir, and what that does is it gets the next file within that directory with whatever file extension, in this case SLDPRT. Now it's not in an infinite loop. Now it's going to traverse through all the SLDPRTs until it tries to grab the next one, and there isn't one, in which case str file name is going to be empty, and then it's going to leave the loop. And in our case, the last line of code we're going to have down here is one belonging to ISLDworks called close all documents. And that's just going to obviously close everything. And if we want to include unsaved documents, we could say true, but just to be safe, I'm going to put in false there. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is actually open the part. Because remember, originally we were getting the active document, but now we're not, because we want to keep opening documents. So open new document, And what I'll do is I'll set SW model equal to SW app OpenDoc6, and this is going to open an existing document. So actually it's not a new document. We'll just say open the document. And then since I'm returning a return value, I need to have all the arguments in parentheses. So the file name is going to be our constant and str file name. And now what are the rest of the options? Okay, first of all, there's the path to the file. Then there's the type of document, so that means part, assembly, or drawing. So in this case, we're only opening parts. And then for options, this is where I'm going to put in SW open doc options silent. Kind of like down below when I did save doc options silent. It's the same thing for opening documents, and this is what's going to suppress that dialog saying, hey, this part was created in an educational version. Then the rest of the arguments, we have configuration. Basically, do we want to open up a certain configuration when the part opens? If we put an empty, it'll just open the last used one, which is fine for us since we're assuming there's only one configuration in these parts. And then errors and warnings, again, it's like when you save a document, you can get output arguments telling you if any issues came up. We're going to assume that there are none, so we're going to put an empty, close that off with our final parenthesis. And now let's save this and try it out. Okay, and it didn't close any of them because these aren't saved yet. But anyway, if we go into the configurations for each one of these, we see that indeed there is a right-hand and a left-hand version now. And likewise with this guy. And then of course with the one that we've been using throughout the demonstration already. Now the last thing I would recommend you do as a matter of good programming practice is give a little description at the top of your macro saying what the macro does and what the preconditions are for running it properly. So basically whoever modifies this next can come in here and get an idea of how to properly use this macro. And then it's also good to note that you wrote this and maybe give them a way to contact you. So say something like this. And then finally put the date or maybe a version number. So in our case, November 5th, 2013. And that way if your macro is being used within a company, you can determine whether an employee is using the latest version of the macro or an obsolete version. And with that, we conclude another video on how to write a simple yet powerful macro from scratch. Please feel free to leave a comment. Subscribe to our channel because we'll have more videos like this coming. And also, if you're interested in learning more API programming, head on over to cadsharp.com and sign up for a free membership. Thanks for watching.